In this edition of Low Code Feature Focus, we'll talk about building an API endpoint. An API endpoint can be used to provide interaction with external systems, allowing you to provide information to an outside system or allowing that system to interact with your system. In this demonstration, I'm going to build an API endpoint that will allow an external source to get a list of all of the users of my system and an additional endpoint to get the full details of a specific user. And then we're going to test that integration using an online tool called Swagger. Finally, we'll demonstrate the security that's available to enable on your endpoint to ensure that it's only used by authorized users. So let's get started. The API Endpoint module is available as a standalone module, or it's included with Plant an App. First, a little bit about my setup. I'm going to take a look at the configuration and look at the users that I have defined in my system. And you'll see that I have two users, a Dale Warner user and a Joe demo user. So these will be the users that will be returned by our endpoint. Next, we take a look at the API section and see that we have some APIs that were pre-built automatically as you build entities, but we're going to build a new endpoint today. So for the first endpoint, we're going to build an endpoint that will allow us to get a list of users. So we'll create a new endpoint and we'll call it get users. This is going to be a get HTTP method, and we'll give it a description. After we provide the description, we're going to go to the input parameters. And in this case, there are no input parameters. We're going to return all of the users on the first call. It's a very simple implementation, and it's just meant for a demonstration. So this is going to be done in two simple actions. The first action is to get the list of users from the database. So we'll do a SQL call, and we're going to load entities into SQL. And the SQL that we're going to use is we're just going to return basic information, the user ID, first name, and last name from the users. And we're going to output this to an entity called user list. So we'll be using user list in the next step because we're going to add a response that is an output, and we're going to output a JSON entity list. And the entity name that we're going to output is user list, and the HTTP code that we're going to return is 200 OK. That's a signal to the caller that this HTTP call get has succeeded. Finally, we're going to save this and test it. So now when we hit execute, since there's no parameters, it's just going to return an answer. And so we see a JSON list that shows Dale Warner and my Joe demo user as well. So now we've returned a good list of users, and we'll pay attention here. For example, Joe demo is user ID 4. We'll use that in the next step. So we'll go back and create a new endpoint. This endpoint is going to be called get user by ID, and this is also a get. In this case, we are going to have a parameter. It's going to be the user ID. So we're specifying that they must provide a user ID. We're not going to do any validation at this point. The actions are very similar to the last one. We're also going to do a SQL action and load entities from SQL. We're going to get all data for the user, and that's going to be SQL that's going to be select everything from user ID is equal to, and now we're going to use a parameter, and the parameter is user ID. It's always best to bind your tokens to the SQL to prevent any kind of SQL injection. So we're using a parameter called user ID. We're going to pass in the value of user ID from the input parameter above. We're going to output an entity called user. And in the same way as before, we're going to output a JSON entity called result as the description, we're going to give a same 200 OK code, and the entity that we're going to return is user, the same user that we created here. We're now going to return here. So when we save and test this, it now asks us for user ID. If we give it a user ID of 4 and execute, we see that the Joe demo user with all his fields comes up. So in 2 simple steps, we created our 2 endpoints, but now we want to make sure that there is appropriate security. So we'll go to the security settings and we're going to add a new security token. This is a token that is going to have to be used by anything that calls this to validate that they have rights to access this data. So I'm going to call this the API test. You might use it to identify either the process or the person that you've given this permission out to. You can use the security section to remove or add additional keys as necessary. So we've added a key, and now we're going to also go back to our 2 API endpoints, edit them, and add the security. We're going to allow public access. There's several methods, but we're going to allow public access, but just restrict it to the keys that we've talked about. So we've done that for this one. And then we also go to the get user by ID, edit the endpoint, and also restrict to just this key. So now let's see how we might consume something like that. If we go to a tool like Swagger Inspector, and the URL for this is going to be in the comments of this low-code feature focus, you can use Swagger Inspector to interact with your API endpoints and test to make sure that they work as you expect. So let's look at the first one. It asks for a URL that you're going to use, and then an authentication. So we'll go to our endpoint, and we're going to, if you edit the endpoint, and now we see a friendly endpoint name here. So we're going to test out get users first. So I'm going to copy this link address and put it in the get parameter. When I send that request, and we're going to get an error that the current request is not authorized. That, of course, is because we're not passing the authorization token. So we'll add that. It's you can pass it in a couple of ways, but one way is to, in the authentication section, you can say authorization. And then the value is your security token. So we'll go and copy our security token and paste it into our API. So now when we run, we say send, and now we get a list of users. And it's just returning the user ID, first name, last name for all of our test users. Now let's test our other endpoint. We go back and look at our endpoints, manage endpoints, and we're interested in trying out the get user by ID. And then the same way, we are going to copy this address, the address name of the friendly endpoint, and paste it into Swagger. In this case, we also need to pass a parameter, which would be the user ID. And we're going to pass in a value of 4. When we send the request, we get back user ID number 4 and all of the information for that user. So just a quick word about security. When you're testing security for an endpoint and you're using API keys, just remember that if you're logged in to the interface as an admin user, that Swagger call is going to work whether or not you provide an API key. The admin user provides a bypass for security. So in my testing, I used an alternate browser that was not logged in to the API endpoint, and so therefore required the use of a valid authorization code. That's it. In this low-code feature focus, we built 2 API endpoints, one that returned a list of users and the other to return the details of a specific user. We also tested it via Swagger. Is there some feature you'd like to see in our next video? Leave a comment in the section below. And for more great low-code content, be sure to subscribe to Plant an App.